Let's start with the Baltimore Ravens, okay? So the Ravens are a team, they've got an elite player at quarterback, right? And that's what everything kind of builds around. But Dalton, when you look at the Baltimore Ravens, this is sort of, what is this, like the third year in a row where it feels like it's been disappointing for this team in one way or another to at least not get to the Super Bowl. So this is one of those teams that would like that Howie Roseman type of an offseason to hit everything pretty perfectly for them. So I'll just start with team needs. I'll start with team needs before we get into specific targets of like players in the draft, players in free agency. When you looked at the Ravens, what was something that was holding them back a little bit from really getting to the Super Bowl and winning a Super Bowl this season?
Look, I mean, they don't have a ton of flaws, right? And that's kind of the beauty of their team is you've got an elite quarterback and a team that doesn't have a boatload of flaws where they, when you talk about them losing to Buffalo in the playoffs, it was really more about execution than it was about the talent level of their team, right? I think they definitely have enough talent to compete for a Super Bowl, but you look at them right now, and I think the first thing that stands out is that Ronnie Stanley and Patrick McCarry, their starting left tackle and left guard, are both free agents. And I think that's a part where as much as they want to run the football, and obviously for as long as Lamar Jackson often wants to hold the ball, pass protection is key. I think especially when you talk about Stanley, who's really been one of the best pass protectors of the last decade, that's going to be a key piece. I think there's going to be other teams, including other contenders, that are going to be looking at him for the pass blocking prowess. And, if they can't figure that out, that becomes an immediate need, I think, in the draft. So you look at left tackle and left guard on the offensive line. I think some help at cornerback would be ideal too, right? I think maybe to improve upon Brandon Stephens in that outside slot, or if they move Marlon Humphrey back outside, then you talk about maybe getting a legitimate nickel in there because he was kind of playing out of position. He was playing well, but he was playing out of position. And then the last thing I think, you think about Kyle Van Noy's a free agent too. We haven't seen the Eagles have an elite edge rusher in a long time. I think that's another one where, okay, they have some good players, right? Odafe Owe, David Ojabo's coming along, but finding one more of those just really good stand-up edge rushers that they like in that two-point stance. So I do think the challenge for the Ravens is that they don't have a ton of cap space and they have needs at a couple of really expensive spots, right? Think about O-line, edge rusher, cornerback. These are some of the more expensive things to acquire in free agency. So I think there could be a heavy draft focus if they can't keep one or two of these guys that they're losing to free agency.
Yeah, $2.9 million in effective cap space. We're using over the cap for this. And effective cap space, you'll hear me talk about that a lot here on this show and on the next show when we do NFC. Essentially, what effective cap space does is it gives you the projected cap space that you have overall this offseason, but then you have to build in your rookie draft class, right? I mean, like some people look at just the raw salary cap that they have available, and I'm just using a round number here. Maybe they'll go, oh, we have $10 million in free agency, so let's go get a free agent who's just going to cost us like $10 million. It's like, well, you have to think about you're going to have to sign your rookie class as well. So that's anywhere from like $6 to $9 million normally, depending on how big your draft class is. So that sort of goes into it, how many picks you have. So the effective cap space, which takes into account sort of an estimate of what it would take to sign an upcoming draft class for them, puts them at $2.9 million, and that's just 22nd in the NFL. So that's not a lot to work with. You mentioned key free agents. Ronnie Stanley's the big one. Patrick McCarry's another one. And then I think the other three that you have to talk about at least, well, Marcus Williams and Brandon Stephens, and I think are the big ones because when you look at those two guys, feels like Marcus Williams is out there. Darius Washington's also a free agent. I can't remember if he's a restricted free agent or not. I have to look that up in a second to make sure. But you go, okay, well, if you bring Brandon Stephens back, then are you probably not going to be able to bring Darius Washington back? If you're bringing Darius Washington back, can you bring Brandon Stephens back? So it feels like there's going to be a little bit of a give and take because of how little salary cap money that they have there for them. When you look at sort of some projected free agents, obviously, like, we can't really shoot for the moon here with this team because they don't have a lot of cap space. But when you look at potential free agents or even the draft, do you have maybe a formula or say like, okay, I would like it if they'd go after this sort of a player or this position in free agency and then this sort of player or free agent when it comes to the player or position when it comes to the draft?
So I think, first of all, you mentioned Darius Washington. He is a restricted free agent. And honestly, with the impact that he had down the stretch on their defense, I would prioritize him over Brandon Stephens, because once Washington got on the field, you could argue that him and Kyle Hamilton were the best pair of safeties in the league, really fixed that entire coverage unit, turned a 180 in the middle of the season, a lot because Washington got on the field as a starter and started playing well. I think the first thing I would look at in free agency is what what would it take to re-sign Ronnie Stanley? I think that's a big thing. There's not really, other than maybe an Alaric Jackson from the Rams who's going to cost a lot, there's not really any franchise cornerstone kind of left tackles in free agency. That's the first place I would be looking, because I think that left tackle spot could really set them up. If they can re-sign Stanley, it could set them up to go elsewhere in the draft instead of maybe feeling like they have to take a tackle early, because it's not the deepest left tackle class, especially. We've got a lot of guys moving inside and some more questionable talents in the mid-rounds, but that's a spot I would go. If we're looking edge rusher on the free agent market, if he were willing to leave the Chargers, or if they could, I don't know what kind of bidding war it would take, but I think Khalil Mack could be a reasonable option for them, right? Even at his age, still playing fantastic football. And if you're looking at maybe moving Marlon Humphrey back outside, I think about a slot corner like a Mike Hilton from the Cincinnati Bengals, who would really fit into that aggressive style of defense the Ravens play. And then I look at the draft, and it all kind of builds from there, right? I think you think about, that left tackle spot. If they don't re-sign Stanley, then that's a spot I start thinking about with that late first-round pick. I think Josh Connerly Jr. from Oregon is a plug-and-play starter who can come in, at least give them solid pass protection as he continues to develop. But I do think there's a pretty good chance he's going to be at least a B to B plus starter. If he ends up playing as well as Ronnie Stanley for a handful of years, then fantastic. But I think, the same idea with, say, a Tyler Booker on the inside. If you lose Patrick McCarry, you still need a left guard. I think Booker's a high-floor starter that could be available at that spot. Jahdae Barron from Texas, you talk about either a zone outside corner if you're leaving Marlon Humphrey inside, or a guy who can move inside to the nickel himself like he did at Texas. I think Barron would be a great fit if he were to fall to them. And then if you were going edge rusher with that late first-round pick, I think Donovan Ezeraku, look, he's one of the best stand-up, two-point stance pass rushers in this draft. I think he would really fit in with that front seven, work into the rotation, especially on late down. So those are just, for me, the Ravens. The focus is really, it's kind of layered for them, because to me it starts with Ronnie Stanley and whoever they're able to retain, and then it goes to that first round pick, and then they can build out the rest of the draft from there. So it's going to be kind of some layered decision making here for them.
Yeah, I love the suggestions that you made. Obviously, I think that Khalil Mack makes a ton of sense for them. I don't know if they can make it work numbers-wise. They'd have to have some cap wizardry, I think, to be able to get him on the team, especially if you're not sacrificing, like, all right, we're bringing in Khalil Mack, but we're also not signing Ronnie Stanley or Patrick McCarry or any of these cores. So if you want to bring in Khalil Mack, it's kind of a little bit of a give and take, but certainly I think that he would make a lot of sense for them. Love the Donovan Ezeraku call, and, when I think that it's a good call out by you. If they're going to stay with sort of the same scheme and they're going to have more of a cover three look to them, I think Will Johnson's an excellent cover three corner from Michigan, but he's not going to make it to them at the back end of the first round. And then you look at some other guys that we sort of like project as corners that could be late first, early second round guys. Trey Amos from Ole Miss, Siobhan Revelle from ECU. I like Darian Porter from Iowa State. You even go a little bit further. You even get into like second, third round guys like Maxwell Harrison from Kentucky, Azarie Thomas from Florida State. A lot of those dudes are like man coverage type of corners. They're not really those off coverage zone type of corners. So it's just something you got to think about there. I like the Donovan Ezeraku call. I think he'd be fantastic for the Baltimore Ravens. Another guy that I would shout out there is Kyle Kennard from South Carolina, because he's somebody who I think can rush from that 2-point stance as well. I think he can play in that outside linebacker spot too. So I think that's a good game plan for them. It makes a lot of sense, but I do agree with you. What happens on the offensive line is probably going to determine how they attack the NFL draft. So if they're able to bring Ryan Stanley back, or what happens with Patrick McCarry, that's going to be probably their primary focus when it comes to the first round. Cincinnati Bengals. Bengals have $42.8 million in effective cap space. That is 10th in the NFL. So they have a good chunk of change to be able to work with here, but I think the looming part of this is T. Higgins is a free agent. Jamar Chase still has a deal that needs to be done. Trey Hendrickson was sort of unhappy with where the team was and probably wanting a new contract as well. There were some reports of that this past season. Key free agents for them, I mentioned Higgins is one, BJ Hill's another, Mike Hilton, who you talked about as a target for the Ravens. It's because he's a free agent there for the Bengals. Trent Brown's also a free agent. Akeem Davis-Gaither, so that maybe brings up a linebacker need for them. Mike Gesicki, we've talked about potentially a tight end landing spot for like a Tyler Warren or a Colson Loveland. It's because he is a free agent, and they would probably want somebody who could really help them out in the passing game there at that position as well. But, Dalton, when you think about the Cincinnati Bengals, a lot of their struggles did come on that defensive side of the ball. Is that where you go for your team needs here with them?
Yeah, it's tough because you've got a team, and they still finished 9-8 this past season because obviously the quarterback and the receiving core is so good, but you've got needs all over the defense. They were near the bottom of the league again in safety rankings, and that's been a problem since Jesse Bates left. Defensive tackle's a major issue, and you just mentioned they're losing, the best of a rough bunch in B.J. Hill there if he leaves in free agency. The interior offensive line is a perpetual issue with them, even though they've spent a good amount of money on it in recent years. They have issues protecting Joe Burrow, and they're really just lucky that he can process the field so fast. And then I think obviously the biggest story, maybe the biggest story of all free agency is, can they find a way to keep T. Higgins, right? Can they find a way to, restructure some things and work the cap like Joe Burrow's been talking about some other teams can do? He's been kind of going scorched earth on it. Do they have it? Are they willing to do it? Are they willing to maybe restructure some things and keep T. Higgins? Because that really then throws wide receiver into the list of needs if he leaves, right? Because you're really just sitting there with Jamar Chase, and your third leading receiver, like you mentioned, Mike Gesicki, he was a free agent also. So you're talking really now about this team getting down to the bare bones at the moment of just being Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and Trey Hendrickson, who you mentioned is unhappy with the contract. So there's a lot of needs the Bengals have. This is a really big offseason for them, and I think it does start with whether or not they can keep Higgins.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that Higgins, bringing him back makes the most sense for this team because of it's almost like they proved it this past year anyways. 9-8, still above 500, and this defense was terrible. I mean, you're hoping that they don't suffer as many injuries as they do next year that they had this year with some of those key players. You're hoping that you're getting better on the defensive line. There's no doubt about it. But, the Bengals are in a situation where they're picking in the 20s. I believe their pick is 17th. And I think that you can still get an impact wide receiver at that spot. Like Matthew Golden, Luther Burden III could very well be available for them at number 17. And if you don't bring back T. Higgins, I just feel as though when I've mocked wide receiver to the Bengals, a lot of Bengals fans hate it. They go, no, like the defense is so bad. And it's like, if you guys lose T, Jermaine Burton did not turn out to be the steal that you thought that he was going to be. In fact, he was completely unreliable for you and wasn't even able to be on the field and dressed in certain situations. So, beyond him, are you really going to be able to go into next season with just Jamar Chase and Andre Yoshevich? I cannot imagine that that's any sort of recipe for success, because the defense was also, it felt like, so devoid of talent last year that if you make a handful of additions to the defensive side of the football, but you lose T. Higgins, you're not really any better as a football team. It would probably take both in order for you to get to where you want to go back into the playoffs next year. So I agree with you. I just think that re-signing T. Higgins is paramount for this football team, because whether or not you want to say, well, is it the biggest, is it the best use of resources because that you're going to have to pay Jamar Chase as well? If you don't sign T. Higgins, you better hope Luther Burden III is there at number 17, because if not, then I don't really know where else you go. Do you take a chance on Stephon Diggs coming off of an ACL tear because you think he's going to be a little bit cheaper in price? You're going to get him for a discount because he's above 30 and he's coming off a major injury? But then that's a huge risk in and of itself. It's just it's hard to imagine the Bengals being as good as they want to be next year if they don't bring both of these wide receivers back, because they just don't have a lot of other talent. But what are some other names, some draft names, some free agent names that you got for this team?
So, I think, again, Higgins is going to be the big story when it comes to receiver in the free agent market. But I think otherwise this is a spot where you maybe try to find some value, right? They've got the 10th most effective cap space, but you still have to distribute it with so many needs, right? And maybe even take some chances. I think about, improving that safety spot. Maybe somebody like Julian Blackmon from the Colts who, we'll see with Al Golden coming in as their defensive coordinator, how much single high he's going to use. I don't know if it'll be quite as much, just press man and cover one like he did at Notre Dame, because that's pretty much all he had to use at Notre Dame to get to the national title game. But Julian Blackmon is someone at safety I would like for them. Poona Ford, the defensive tackle from the Chargers, one of the best run stoppers in the league this year for the Chargers. If they can get him maybe on a 1 or 2 year deal to fix up that run defense while they find other solutions. And then even on the offensive line, I would keep looking for interior help, right? Maybe you take a gamble on a guy going back to the Colts, actually, like Will Fries, who for the first 5-6 weeks this year before he had a big leg injury that took him out, he was one of the breakout stars in the NFL, playing like one of the best guards in football. If you can get him healthy and back in the starting lineup, Maybe you got some potential there to get some value in a starting offensive lineman at the very least. And then I look at the draft, and, you mentioned some of the round one options with wide receiver, but even if they decide to go defense, there's still some guys, I think, who could help them, say, on day two. I think about, we're going from one Higgins to another. I think about Iowa State wide receiver Jaden Higgins, who has very similar size to T. Higgins. Maybe he's not quite the athlete that T is, but Jaden's a really good possession receiver, works really well, had a perfect 99.9 intermediate receiving grade, which is honestly exactly where T. Higgins shines as well. So that could be somebody on day two as an option. You roll back to round one. I think about a guy like Walter Nolan, who had the second best run defense grade of all defensive tackles this year in college football, to break out for Ole Miss. Same idea. Maybe Al Golden brings a Xavier Watts at safety. He was this dynamite free safety who had all his interceptions at Notre Dame. He could bring him along just because he already knows him, and I think he would help that defense a lot. And then, again, I think about interior protection as an alternative to anybody in free agency. Somebody like Tate Ratledge from Georgia, who's a plus pass protector, could probably slot in at either guard spot if they want. We know with the Bengals, it's been a rotation for a long time at left guard between a lot of different players. And then on the other side at right guard, Alex Kappa didn't exactly have his best year. So I just think it's all the same needs here, and it depends on which road they want to go down. If they do sign T. Higgins, then you're talking about a route where they can really go heavy in the draft on defense, right? Walter Nolan and Xavier Watts round 1 and 2 would be something like an ideal situation, right? And we've talked about this is a draft where you can take multiple defensive linemen because it's such a deep class, even into rounds 4 and 5. So I don't think that'll be as big an issue. I'd still like to see them sign maybe 1 or 2 cheaper veterans in free agency, but the T. Higgins decision is really what's going to lay the groundwork for the rest of it.
Yeah, I like the Will Fry shout out. Maybe James Daniels as well, played well, very small sample size before he gets hurt. But again, something like that where they can get a couple of new bodies along the interior offensive line. They can make their splashes on the offensive side of the ball in free agency, and that frees you up to draft some really good players. If they don't hit offensive line in free agency, I like the idea of them taking one of these tackles and moving him inside. We've seen sort of we have a long list, I think, of guys who played offensive tackle in college who are going to be kicking inside of the NFL. So like Marcus Mbow from Purdue, Charles Grant maybe from William & Mary, if you really believe in his talents and how well he played at William & Mary, if you think that's going to translate to the league. Was really impressed with Anthony Belton when he was at the Senior Bowl as somebody who played tackle at NC State, played really well at guard. Jalen Rivers from Miami, maybe a little bit further down in the mid round. So those are some targets for them along the interior offensive line. Because as much as we emphasize receiver, I do want to say the interior offensive line was not good enough to win football games last year, and I think that definitely showed. Burrow made up for a lot of it, but I think they definitely need to address that in a big way. So move on to the Cleveland Browns. Browns are in a very rough spot. I'm sorry to our producer Tyler, who is putting on this show. He was a big Browns fan. It's been a tough couple of years. I don't know if it gets better this offseason. I'm sorry, buddy. Negative $38.6 million effective cap space. That is 31st in the NFL. The only team that has a projected lower amount of effective cap space is the New Orleans Saints. Guys that you have coming up that are free agents, Jedrick Wills, Nick Chubb. I think the big one for them, though, is the fact that it's not just Jedrick Wills. Joel Bitonio, Wyatt Teller, Ethan Posick along the offensive line as well are free agents next year. And all of them are above the age of 30. Jack Conklin's a free agent the year after, but his contract is sort of flexible to where, he's one of the guys that you're throwing out there of okay, do you have to cut Jack Conklin just to make the cap room to be able to trade Myles Garrett if a Myles Garrett trade is going to happen here for this team? Because remember, it's not like it's a lot of cap relief. Well, it's not any cap relief at all for this team if they trade Myles Garrett, and Myles Garrett has already said that he wants out. If they trade him, it's another $36 million on the cap. And so they've got a lot of reasons to not trade Myles Garrett. Financially is one of them, but if he is disgruntled and he's pissed off and he doesn't want to play for you, he might be forcing their hand anyway. So the Myles Garrett situation has to play out. There's no doubt about it. And then sort of what they're even going to do to get cap compliant, and then sort of what their roster looks like after that. So we always talk about the caveat of, hold on, team needs, we got to get the free agency, we got to see what they're going to do in free agency before we get to draft needs and things like that. We got to see what the Browns are even going to do before the new league year opens up, and they can get closer to where they need to be cap compliant. But when you look at this team, a little bit independent of sort of what I just talked about there, roster wise, what are the team needs for this team to play a lot better in 2025?
I mean, the first thing they do need to do is trade Myles Garrett. I know it's a lot of money, but you're essentially buying whatever draft picks you get out of that. And then I've told you before, I think I would trade down from that number 2 overall slot. I don't think that for all the needs you just mentioned, because the first thing I wrote down here for their needs was everything on offense, just everything. They were the lowest graded offense in football this past year, and there just doesn't seem to be any long-term hope. You even mentioned all those offensive linemen. It's one of the older offensive lines in the league. This was going to naturally erode anyway. They built it for a couple of playoff runs that they did have, and now all those guys are getting older, and pass protection's an issue, and pretty much everything aside from Jerry Jeudy is a massive question mark on this offense right now. So I look at that, and then if you look at the defensive side of the ball, I think some more interior pass rush and another corner alongside Denzel Ward who can play in man coverage, right? You saw a lot of struggles last year from Martin Emerson and Greg Newsome because they play so much cover one in this defense under Jim Schwartz. And, Ward had 17 pass breakups, but the rest of the unit really struggled at corner. So it's like you mentioned, it's going to be tough for them in free agency to find legitimate options. They're going to have to really nail this draft and probably one or two more just to get themselves back relevant with where their roster is at.
Yeah, and sort of like I was talking about when we were going over this for the Ravens, there's a lot of decent man coverage option corners that this team has. So if they want to stay aggressive with it and they want to get a corner, sometime on day 2, if they trade back from pick number 2, the further you trade back, obviously, the more you're going to get in return. A guy like Darian Porter, a guy like Maxwell Harrison, a guy like Azareye'h Thomas, like those corners that are in the draft are man coverage type of corners, and I think it could be a lot of fun for this team. Maybe the standout that we had from the Shrine Bowl, Kobe Bryant, he's somebody that you maybe could draft in the early parts of days 3. So I think that he's somebody that you could also shout out there for corner. But any dynamic answer in the run game, any sort of offensive lineman that they can get in the farm system, even for a year, maybe it's an interior offensive lineman behind the guys that they have there. And, if they can't bring those guys back, if they retire, if they're going to other teams, you got somebody in waiting, and it's not a terrible situation there. I like the Paulson Adebo call out that you had sort of on the sheet here as a potential free agent option. Hard for them to really go after and sign these guys, though. So Cleveland, it's just tough because until we know what happens with Myles Garrett, because of how much that means against their salary cap, and then just even independent of that, getting above the salary cap floor, that's the important part of this team. But just so much on offense. They need another receiver. They need a dynamic player in the run game. They obviously need a quarterback as well. And quarterback, the guy who's on the roster, is a big reason why they are so hamstrung and why Myles Garrett wants out. So that's sort of a story in and of itself. So it's tough. I don't really have a lot of suggestions for Cleveland because I'm not a cap guru who knows how to work all of this myself. And so when I look at Cleveland, it's hard to not think, and I see some people in the chat saying this, like, you basically have to forget about 2025 and 2026. Like, you basically just have to take it on the chin that you signed Deshaun Watson and you made one of the worst trades in sports history. You kind of have to just work through that, and you have to hope that your team looks completely different in 2026 and 2027. It's hard for me to give Browns fans much hope outside of that, outside of Deshaun is your quarterback next year, maybe even if he's coming back from the Achilles injury, which maybe he's not. And like maybe they're going to play better, but it's just there's so many layers to the Browns that I hate being this negative about it. I just don't know where they go. I don't know where they go other than the number one thing they can do this offseason is, like you mentioned, trade down from number 2. And I'm talking about you should trade down from number 2. Sometimes we talk about, well, you want to trade down from the top 3, but you don't want to get too far down because you still want to get a good player. At this point, screw that. Go from 2 to 23. I don't care. Get multiple first-round picks, get multiple second-round picks over the next couple of drafts, because to me, that's how you actually get this team to where you want to go. So I think that trading that number 2 overall pick is probably their best move there to attack all those team needs. Last team in the AFC North is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Steelers have a lot of cap space, $50.1 million in effective cap space. That's the 8th most in the NFL. James Daniels, a free agent. Russ Justin Fields, those are the big ones. Sort of what decision are you making there? Najee Harris, also a free agent. But an interesting one for me is Nate Herbig. Maybe, him hitting the market. Maybe less so for the Pittsburgh Steelers because it feels like they got a lot of pass rushers there, but he's more of an underrated one that you look at for other teams, and you talk about a situational pass rusher who's had some really good games this past season and over the last couple of years. He's somebody to keep an eye on. Dante Jackson, also a free agent. Preston Smith, 33, 34 years old. He's also a free agent. What's Pittsburgh's biggest team needs here, Dalton?
I think the biggest problem is that we have no idea what the future looks like at quarterback, right? You mentioned Wilson and Fields, both free agents, and Russell Wilson seems to have a desire to come back. The team seems to have a desire for Justin Fields to come back as well. It seems like they want to run it back with the same crew. The question is whether or not they're how much they're willing to pay for both of those guys, right? They got Russell Wilson on $1 million deal last year, and he was one of the biggest bargains in football, right? Despite the way that it ended, he played really well considering he was making $1 million from them and the rest of his money from Denver. So we really don't know what their quarterback situation looks like, right? And even in the entire backfield, Najee Harris being a free agent, they need kind of an early down back. I know Jalen Warren's good. He's very efficient, but he can't be the only guy in your backfield. And then in the passing game, I look at they just don't have enough at receiver, right? George Pickens is a really good deep threat, but they don't have a guy who gives them a lot of yards after the catch. That's something I would be looking for, too. Somebody who can take those shorter targets and create explosive plays out of them. And then the one big problem on what's generally a really good defense is that cornerback spot, right? We know Joey Porter Jr.'s got potential, and he's not quite great and as high as you think he might because, the lack of ball production, but they need somebody on the other side at corner who can be productive for him because, honestly, it was a black hole last year. Teams figured out as long as you get rid of the ball quickly and get rid of it to the outside, you're not going to have a whole lot of issues dealing with this pass rush because you can protect yourself, and these corners can't cover one-on-one. So I think you have a lot of needs on offense, and then you have one big one on defense that they need to figure out.
The chat correctly correcting me. It's Nate Herbig, this free agent from the Pittsburgh Steelers, not Nick Herbig. So sorry about that. Thanks, chat, for keeping me in line there. Just wanted to make sure that we reiterated that. I'm looking at your free agent list here for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Love Luther Burden for them. If they can get another dynamic wide receiver there, I think that makes a ton of sense. Love Damian Martinez as well. Like, he's somebody who's very intriguing to me. He really productive year this past year when he was at Miami. Just a bigger back, somebody who it feels like the size-speed combination the Pittsburgh Steelers always gravitate towards. I was worried about sort of what he was going to be able to give you on third down when I was watching him at Miami, but he felt like he was a lot more focused, a lot more motivated to be a better pass catcher, better pass protector when I was watching him in Mobile. So that was a good sign that that's still there with him because he is a bigger back and he's alluring for those reasons. Getting a corner like Siobhan Ravel, I think it makes a ton of sense for this team. Joey Porter Jr. has really struggled so far. So even though you know that they're not going to move on from him, can he man those CB1 duties for you moving forward? I'm not so sure that you just want to go into next year and say, like, oh, yeah, we're going to be good. JPJ is going to be fantastic in that area. I think adding another corner, I think, could definitely make sense. I like who we have on this list as well with Carlton Davis III. If he hits free agency, I think that he could make a ton of sense for the way that they played coverage last season as well. Anybody else that you want to shout out here before we move on?
No, I think just to expand on Martinez a bit, one of the comps that actually Max Chadwick has been throwing at me the last couple weeks at him, and he's like, he's kind of got that James Conner feel to him, right? He's big, he's 230 pounds, pretty easily projectable as an early down back, and I think somebody who'd be really not fun to tackle in the cold weather. He just kind of, the more I thought about this, and I'm like, well, I'm picking and prodding with all these running backs in this loaded class that we have, and I'm like, who fits in where, right? Who needs what exact skill? Because there's so many different types of backs too. And I look at, in the past, they've had James Conner, you think about Najee Harris the last few years, they've always had that bigger back who can just lean forward and keep your offense on schedule. And Martinez felt like that guy for me. So I think definitely a mid-round target for them.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe the video. And if you don't have a PFF Plus subscription, you can get one to see all the premium stats that we talked about here on the show, plus the expert betting and fantasy advice over at subscribe.pff.com. The description is also right below, so if you are not a PFF Plus subscriber, you can become one today.